Walk through the historical record and you'll find an almost dizzying pile of competing explanations, each stated with total confidence, each contradicting the last. Medieval church records sometimes describe Roma travelers as pilgrims, performing penance for some vague ancestral sin, wandering the earth as punishment. Government officials in various European countries over the many centuries drafted laws and decrees describing Roma populations, using whatever theory of origin happened to be politically convenient at the time, sometimes framing them as foreign invaders to be expelled, other times as a permanently rootless people incapable of belonging anywhere at all. Folklorists collecting European legends often filed Roma origin stories alongside fairy tales and superstition, treating the question of where this population actually came from as charming mystery rather than a serious historical question deserving real investigation. For centuries, almost every story told about the Roma people was told by someone else. European chroniclers, government officials, folklorists collecting what they assumed were quaint local legends, all confidently described a mysterious wandering population using whatever theory happened to be fashionable at the time. Egyptian wanderers, cursed for some ancient, half-remembered sin, a tribe expelled long ago from some distant, half-imagined homeland, nobody could ever quite specify with any real precision or confidence, a people defined almost entirely by outsiders, rarely by themselves, and almost never by actual evidence. For hundreds of years, the real origin of the Roma people sat buried underneath layer after layer of myth, prejudice, and confident guesswork, repeated so often across so many European languages that guesswork eventually started passing for settled fact. Then, geneticists finally got the chance to ask the Roma genome itself where it actually came from. And the answer didn't just settle a centuries-old mystery. It quietly dismantled almost everything the outside world had spent generations insisting was true. This is the story of how DNA evidence finally traced the Roma people back to their real point of origin, and it starts with understanding just how tangled and how consistently wrong the old assumptions actually were. To understand why this genetic answer mattered so much, you first have to understand the sheer scale of confusion that surrounded Roma origins for most of European history. The very word many. Europeans historically used for the Roma, gypsy, comes directly from a mistaken belief that this population originated in Egypt, a theory that took hold in medieval Europe and stubbornly persisted for centuries, despite having essentially no solid evidence behind it at all. Other competing theories placed Roma origins in various parts of the Middle East, or described them vaguely as descendants of some unspecified ancient wandering tribe. Each theory confidently asserted, each one contradicting the others, and none of them grounded in anything more rigorous than surface-level observation and centuries of accumulated cultural assumption. That 18th century discovery itself is worth pausing on, because it's a genuinely fascinating small story of accidental scholarship. According to the historical accounts, most commonly cited, a European student encountered Romani speakers and, by chance, also happened to be acquainted with students from India studying in the same city. Noticing striking similarities between the vocabulary and grammatical structure of Romani and the Indian languages he was already familiar with, he documented the connection and published his observations, effectively identifying the Indian subcontinent as the likely origin of the Romani language, centuries before anyone had the tools to confirm that connection through genetic evidence. It's the kind of discovery that, in a more attentive society, might have immediately overturned centuries of confident misconception. Instead, it largely remained a specialized footnote within academic linguistics, while popular European culture continued repeating the older, more dramatic myths, largely unchanged. What makes this confusion particularly striking is that a real answer had actually been hiding in plain sight for a very long time, available to anyone willing to look closely enough at the evidence that mattered most: language. The Romani language, spoken across Roma communities throughout Europe with considerable regional variation, carries a grammatical structure and core vocabulary that linguists eventually recognized as unmistakably related to languages spoken across the Indian subcontinent. This linguistic evidence had actually been identified by scholars as early as the 18th century, decades before genetics existed as a scientific field at all. And yet, remarkably, that early linguistic evidence largely failed to dislodge the older, more sensationalized myths from popular European imagination, which kept right on describing Roma origins in terms of Egypt or vague Eastern mystery long, after serious scholars had already identified the much more specific and well-supported South Asian connection. If the idea that a population's true origin sat clearly documented in their own language for centuries, while the outside world kept insisting on a completely different, considerably more mythologized story instead, is the kind of thing that grabs your attention. This is exactly the sort of mystery worth sticking around for. Go ahead and hit that like button now. It genuinely helps more people find stories exactly like this one. The actual research process behind this genetic confirmation involved real logistical and ethical care, worth understanding in some detail. Researchers worked directly with Roma communities across multiple European countries, collecting DNA samples through informed voluntary participation, then comparing the resulting genetic data against extensive reference databases representing populations across South Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. This kind of comparative analysis relies on identifying specific patterns of genetic variation, certain combinations of markers that occur at meaningfully different frequencies across different global populations, allowing researchers to statistically trace which reference populations a given sample's ancestry most closely and consistently resembles. When Roma genetic samples were compared against this broad reference framework, the statistical match toward populations in northwestern India was consistent, strong, and reproducible across multiple independent research efforts. Precisely the kind of independent, cross-verified replication that gives a scientific finding this significant its real, durable credibility. Genetic research finally arrived to settle the question with a level of precision linguistic evidence alone couldn't fully provide. By comparing DNA samples collected from Roma communities across multiple European countries against genetic reference data from populations across South Asia, researchers were able to trace Roma ancestry directly back to a specific, relatively narrow founding population originating in what is now northwestern India, with genetic signatures pointing toward a migration that began roughly 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. This wasn't a vague regional approximation. The genetic markers involved were specific and traceable enough to identify not just a broad continent of origin, but a comparatively narrow founding population within that region, considerably more precise than centuries of competing folklore had ever managed to determine. That precision matters enormously because it directly confirmed what the linguistic evidence had been quietly suggesting for over 2 centuries, while adding an entirely new layer of detail linguistics alone could never have provided. Genetic data doesn't just tell researchers roughly where a population's ancestors came from. It can reveal approximately how large the founding population actually was, roughly when the migration began, and how the population's genetic diversity changed as it spread and settled across an entirely new continent. In the case of the Roma, that genetic evidence painted a picture of a comparatively small founding group, undergoing what geneticists call a population bottleneck, a dramatic reduction in genetic diversity consistent with a relatively limited number of original migrants whose descendants then spread out and settled across an enormous and remarkably diverse range of European countries and regions over the following centuries. A useful way to picture a genetic bottleneck like this one is to imagine a large, diverse deck of cards being repeatedly shuffled and dealt down to a much smaller hand, then that smaller hand becoming the only cards available to build every subsequent deck from that point forward. Whatever specific combination happened to be present in that original smaller hand gets carried forward and amplified across every following generation, while the vast additional diversity present in the original, much larger deck simply never makes it into the new lineage at all. This is essentially what happened, genetically speaking, when a comparatively small founding population left the much larger and more genetically diverse population of South Asia and began an entirely new lineage in Europe, one that would eventually spread across the continent while still carrying the genetic imprint of that original, comparatively narrow founding group. Let's slow down and talk about what a population bottleneck actually reveals, because it's a genuinely important piece of this story that goes well beyond simply confirming a point of geographic origin. When a small founding population migrates and settles somewhere new, staying largely isolated from extensive intermarriage with surrounding populations for a significant stretch of time, that isolation leaves a distinctive genetic fingerprint, reduced diversity compared to the much larger source population left behind, along with elevated rates of certain genetic markers that happen to be present by chance in that smaller founding group. Researchers studying Roma genetics found exactly this kind of signature, evidence consistent with a relatively small number of original migrants from South Asia, whose descendants maintained significant genetic distinctiveness even after centuries of living, often in adjacent or overlapping communities, alongside considerably larger surrounding European populations. This bottleneck effect isn't purely an academic curiosity either. It carries genuinely important practical medical implications for Roma communities today, populations that descend from a comparatively small founding group having gone through this kind of genetic bottleneck often show elevated rates of certain rare genetic conditions, simply because a harmful genetic variant present by chance in one of the relatively few original founders can end up considerably more common in the resulting population than it would be in a larger, more genetically diverse group. Medical researchers studying Roma health outcomes have identified several such conditions occurring at notably higher rates within Roma communities compared to surrounding European populations. findings directly traceable to this same founding bottleneck, the broader ancestry research, helped confirm and explain. Understanding this genetic history isn't just about settling an old historical mystery. It has real direct relevance for improving medical screening and care, specifically tailored to Roma communities going forward. If uncovering how genetics can precisely trace a population's true origin after centuries of confident, competing, and ultimately wrong, outside guesswork is the kind of history that fascinates you. Make sure you're subscribed, because this exact kind of quiet genetic detective work keeps settling mysteries that folklore and outside assumption never managed to resolve on their own. It's worth pausing here to think carefully about why outside European society clung so persistently to inaccurate origin myths for centuries, even after more accurate linguistic evidence had already been identified by serious scholars. Part of the answer, likely, comes down to the simple, uncomfortable reality that origin myths about marginalized populations have rarely been primarily about accuracy in the first place. Throughout European history, the Roma faced sustained discrimination, exclusion, and periodic violent persecution, and the various mythologized origin stories attached to them, exotic, foreign, perpetually wandering, disconnected from any specific homeland, often served to reinforce their status as permanent outsiders within European society, regardless of how many generations a given Roma community had actually lived in a particular region. A population confidently, if inaccurately, described as originating from a vague, distant, almost fantastical elsewhere, was always considerably easier to treat as fundamentally foreign and permanently separate than a population whose specific, traceable historical migration could be documented, understood, and explained in ordinary, unremarkable historical terms shared by virtually every other population in Europe. This dynamic reveals something important about how origin stories function more broadly, well beyond just this particular case. The story a society tells about where a marginalized group came from is rarely just neutral historical curiosity. It often does real political and social work, shaping how that group gets treated, whether they're seen as belonging or as permanently other, regardless of how many centuries they've actually lived in the place now treating them as foreign. Genetic evidence, precisely because it doesn't carry any of that inherited social baggage, offers something genuinely valuable in cases like this. A way to finally separate the actual historical facts from the centuries of assumption, prejudice, and mythology that had accumulated on top of them. Researchers have also tried to connect the estimated timing of this migration, roughly 1,000 to 1,500 years ago, to what's independently known about historical events and conditions in northwestern India during that same broad period, hoping to understand what might have actually prompted a population to leave in the first place. While no single, universally agreed explanation has been firmly established, several plausible historical contexts from that era, including periods of political upheaval and shifting regional power structures, offer at least a reasonable framework for understanding why a specific population might have begun a gradual westward migration during roughly that window of time. This remains an active area of ongoing research, a case where genetic evidence has successfully narrowed down the when and the where with real precision, while historians continue working to more fully reconstruct the why behind that original decision to leave. Let's talk about the actual migration itself, because the genetic evidence allows researchers to reconstruct a surprisingly detailed picture of how it likely unfolded. Rather than a single, sudden movement, evidence suggests the migration out of South Asia and into Europe likely occurred gradually over an extended period, with the ancestors of modern Roma communities passing through and spending time in regions including parts of Persia, Anatolia, and the Byzantine Empire before eventually reaching Europe proper. Genetic markers consistent with limited mixing with populations in these intermediate regions support this gradual, multi-stage migration route, rather than suggesting a single, direct, uninterrupted journey completed within just a single generation. This matches reasonably well with what little written historical documentation exists referencing Roma populations passing through these regions during the relevant centuries, offering a rare case where genetic evidence and fragmentary historical record actually reinforce and confirm each other rather than contradicting one another. For many within Roma communities themselves, this genetic confirmation has carried real, personal significance well beyond its scientific value. Community advocates and cultural historians have described the research as a form of vindication, finally, providing rigorous, independently verifiable evidence for a South Asian origin that Roma cultural memory and linguistic tradition had, in their own way, preserved and pointed toward for centuries, even while the surrounding European societies largely ignored or dismissed that connection. Having an outside population's mythologized version of your own history, authoritatively corrected by hard scientific evidence, rather than continuing to rely solely on oral tradition and linguistic scholarship that outside society had spent generations failing to take seriously, represents a meaningful, if long overdue, shift and how this population's own account of itself finally gets treated with the evidentiary weight it always deserved. Once Roma communities arrived in Europe and began settling across the continent, genetic evidence reveals a genuinely fascinating additional layer to the story. The degree of genetic mixing with surrounding European populations varied considerably from region to region, reflecting centuries of differing local social conditions, some regions and time periods more open to intermarriage between Roma and non-Roma populations, others enforcing considerably stricter social separation. Roma communities in different parts of Europe today still show measurably different degrees of genetic mixing with local surrounding populations, a pattern that maps in genuinely revealing ways onto documented regional histories of either relative tolerance and acceptance, or considerably more often across European history, correspondingly less mixing with surrounding populations. A quiet but genuinely striking confirmation of how thoroughly social exclusion, sustained over many generations, leaves a measurable trace in a population's actual genetic record. That correlation deserves to be sat with directly and carefully because it's one of the more genuinely sobering findings connected to this entire body of research. Genetic isolation like this isn't neutral, and it certainly doesn't happen purely by accident or coincidence. It reflects real, lived historical patterns of exclusion, enforced sometimes through informal social pressure and other times through explicit documented legal restriction, actively preventing intermarriage between Roma and surrounding populations across specific regions and specific historical periods. Reading that pattern directly in the genetic record, rather than only through fragmentary written accounts that Roma communities themselves rarely had the opportunity to author or control, adds a genuinely powerful, difficult to dispute layer of evidence to a history of discrimination that outside observers have sometimes been tempted to minimize, downplay, or dismiss as exaggerated, well beyond what the actual historical record supports. There's also a broader scientific point worth drawing out of this discovery, one connecting it to a pattern researchers keep finding across ancient DNA research more generally. Populations that outside observers have historically described using vague, mythologized, or deliberately othering language frequently turn out, once genetic evidence becomes available, to have specific, traceable, entirely ordinary historical origins. No more mysterious or exotic than any other population's documented migration history. The mystery, in cases like this, was never really located in the population itself. It was located in how thoroughly outside observers had failed, whether through ignorance, indifference, or active prejudice, to actually investigate and document the real story with the same rigor routinely applied to the history of more socially privileged populations. This also raises a genuinely important question about representation within the research itself, one worth acknowledging, honestly. For much of the history of genetic and anthropological research more broadly, marginalized populations have too often been studied primarily as objects of outside curiosity, rather than as full participants and collaborators in the research process. Their genetic material analyzed and published without adequate input, consent frameworks, or benefit returning to the communities being studied. Researchers working on Roma genetics in more recent years have increasingly emphasized the importance of genuine community collaboration and informed consent throughout this kind of work, recognizing that a population which has already endured centuries of being described, categorized, and mythologized by outsiders deserves a meaningfully different, more genuinely collaborative relationship with the scientists, now finally uncovering their accurate history, one built on partnership, rather than the older, extractive model of outside researchers simply studying a community from a distance. There's a certain quiet justice in how this story ultimately resolved, worth sitting with directly before we close. The evidence that finally settled. Centuries of outside myth-making didn't come from another outside observer confidently proposing yet another theory. It came from within, from careful study of the Roma people's own preserved language, later confirmed and made precise through direct examination of their own genetic inheritance. In a very real sense, the Roma people had been quietly correcting the record about themselves the entire time, carrying the true story forward in their own speech across dozens of generations, waiting patiently for the rest of the world to finally develop the tools and the willingness to actually listen. So the next time you encounter an old, confident story about where some population supposedly came from, particularly a population that outside society has historically treated as mysterious, foreign, or permanently other, it's worth remembering that confidence and accuracy are two entirely different things. For centuries, an entire continent told itself a story about Roma origins that had almost nothing to do with the actual, traceable historical truth, a truth that had, in an important sense, been sitting, quietly documented in the Roma people's own language and their own genetic inheritance the entire time, waiting patiently for outside observers to finally take it seriously enough to listen, ask the right questions, and let the evidence itself, rather than centuries of accumulated assumption, tell the actual story.